which makes you wonder, why then on day 1 did he search Annie Guthrie's car and then her home and impound that car for more than 40 days? Why on day 2 did he say there was no threat to the community? And why on day 3 did he take the alleged ransom seekers so seriously?
Think about what it takes to know someone well enough to take them, not to rob them, not to break into their house at random, to specifically choose them, to return to their street on 3 separate weekends before making a move, to know what time they come home, to know which door to enter from, to know when they will be alone. That level of knowledge does not come from driving past a house once. It does not come from browsing the internet or looking up an address. It comes from proximity. It comes from time. It comes from being close enough, long enough, that the patterns of someone's life become visible to you in ways that even their own family might not fully notice. And the evidence from this case suggests that someone had exactly that kind of time, that someone used it with patience and purpose, and that what happened to Nancy Guthrie on the night of February 1st was not the beginning of the crime. It was the end of a process that had been underway for weeks, possibly longer, because the FBI did not just ask about January 11th and January 24th as random dates. Those dates mean something specific. 2 law enforcement sources told Fox News digital reporter Michael Ruiz, one of the journalists who has been most reliably sourced on this investigation, that January 11th is the date when a photograph of the suspect was taken at Nancy's home. Not the photograph from February 1st, the night of the abduction, a different photograph, the one that has confused so many people who studied the images the FBI released. The image in which the suspect appears without the backpack, without the gun, without the holster, without, in other words, when any of the equipment that he carried on the night he actually took Nancy. 3 weeks before the abduction, he was there, at her door, without his tools, because he wasn't there to act. He was there to learn. January 24th is the Saturday that falls exactly 1 week before Nancy disappeared. A neighbor told News Nation that FBI agents specifically asked her about footage from that date. Agents who reviewed footage from a nearby home on January 24th did not say what they were looking for, but they came back. They asked. That date means something to them. January 11th, January 24th, February 1st, 3 consecutive Saturdays, 3 weekends of presence, a pattern so methodical, so consistent in its timing, that multiple observers of this case noted it immediately. This person, or these people, were studying Nancy's Saturday night patterns, her routine when family visited, what time she came home, when she would be alone, when the neighborhood would be quiet enough to act without being seen. That is not the behavior of someone who happened to see an elderly woman's house and decided to take a chance. That is the behavior of someone building a file, someone doing the kind of pre-operational surveillance that law enforcement agents themselves are trained to recognize as a precursor to a planned, targeted crime. And here's the detail that makes the 3 Saturdays so significant in the context of what the FBI is now asking in that neighborhood. Whoever came on January 11th without equipment, without a weapon, without anything that would make them look out of place, they had to have a reason to be there that explained their presence on that quiet residential street in the Catalina Foothills. A random stranger walking through that neighborhood 3 weekends in a row would eventually attract attention. But a neighbor belongs there. A neighbor on that street has every reason to be present on a Saturday evening, every reason to be walking past Nancy's house, every reason to observe the patterns of someone's comings and goings without a single person wondering why. That is the question that has sat at the heart of the Nancy Guthrie investigation since the very first day. Not just who did this, but how did they know her well enough to do it? And could the answer be as simple and as chilling as the person who used to live next door? And on day 47 of this investigation, the FBI answered that question with an action rather than a statement. They went back to Nancy's neighborhood. They knocked on doors. They asked about someone specific. A neighbor who lived on that quiet street in the Catalina Foothills, a neighbor who was familiar enough to go unnoticed, a neighbor who moved out before Nancy was taken, and they asked for the names of every single contractor and construction worker who had been present on any building project in that neighborhood in the weeks and months surrounding Nancy's disappearance. They didn't go back because the investigation is collapsing. They went back because the answer to how someone knew Nancy Guthrie well enough to take her has to live somewhere, in someone's memory, in someone's routine, in the daily patterns of a neighborhood that looks safe and ordinary from the outside and turned out to be anything but. This is the investigation that nobody has fully explained yet, and today we're going to walk through every piece of it. Before we go any further, the facts that must be stated clearly. Nancy Guthrie's family, her daughters, her son-in-law, every member of her immediate family, was officially cleared by the Pima County Sheriff's Department on February 16, 2026. They are not suspects. They are victims of this crime in their own right, and they deserve nothing but compassion. Everything in this video is drawn from publicly available reporting by named journalists at established news organizations, including News Nation, Fox News Digital, NBC News, and the Arizona Republic. No one is being accused of any crime. No one has been charged. The neighbor the FBI is asking about has not been publicly identified, has not been named as a person of interest, and has not been accused of involvement in Nancy's disappearance. If you have any information about this case, the FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. That is 1-800-225-5324. A reward of $1.2 million is being offered for information leading to Nancy's safe return. You can also submit tips at tips.fbi.gov. Now let's talk about Nancy Guthrie, because before any of this, before the investigation, before the doorbell camera footage, before the 47 days of searching, she was simply a woman living her life in one of the quieter, safer-feeling corners of Tucson, Arizona. Nancy is 84 years old. She is the mother of NBC Today show anchor Savannah Guthrie. But in her Catalina Foothills neighborhood, she was known for far simpler things. She was the woman who waved at neighbors walking dogs past her home on Camino Real. She sent Christmas cards to people on her street. She attended church regularly, or she used to. She was part of a neighborhood walking group years ago, though her health had slowed her down considerably in the time before she disappeared. She was, by every account from people who knew her, a warm and present member of the community she had lived in for years. She has a pacemaker and requires daily medications. Her family has been transparent about the fact that without those medications, the medical risk is serious. The sheriff made this point explicitly in his early press conferences. 24 hours without her medications, he said, and her life could be in danger. When that urgency has never left this investigation, even as the days have stretched into weeks and the weeks into nearly 2 months. Think about what that picture of Nancy's life means in the context of this investigation. She was a woman with a knowable routine. She had a walking group. Years ago, before her health slowed her down, she waved at the same neighbors on the same street. She had family visit on Saturday evenings. Her garage door opened and closed at predictable times. For anyone paying attention from the proximity of that quiet street, her patterns would have become visible over time without any special effort. A neighbor in the Catalina Foothills, someone who lived on Camino Real, or within a short walk of it, would have had access to all of that simply by being present, simply by living there, simply by existing in the same ordinary world as Nancy Guthrie. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, Nancy had dinner with her daughter Annie and Annie's husband Tommaso Cioni at their home. It was a Saturday, ordinary, family time of the kind that only becomes significant in retrospect, when you understand it was the last time anyone who loves her saw her face clearly and knew she was safe. She was driven back to her home on Camino Real that evening. At 9:48 p.m., according to investigators, her garage door opened. 2 minutes later, it closed. Nancy Guthrie was inside her home for what would be the last confirmed safe moment of the night. 4 hours passed. At 1:32 a.m. on February 1st, a figure appeared on Nancy's Nest doorbell camera. Ski mask, thick gloves, a holster positioned at the front of his waist, a backpack, in already full, not empty and ready to be loaded with stolen items, but packed before he ever arrived. He spent 15 minutes on that front porch moving in strange, indecisive patterns, appearing to work on the camera mechanism, holding vegetation toward the lens. And at 1:47 a.m., the camera went dark. At 2:12 a.m., The camera's software detected motion but had no video to record. Someone was still there. At 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker disconnected from its monitoring app. The signal that had been transmitting her heart data to medical services continuously and reliably simply stopped. At 2:36 a.m., 8 minutes later, a vehicle appeared on a neighbor's Ring camera approximately 2.5 miles from Camino Real. 8 minutes to move a person, reach a vehicle, and travel 2.5 miles through residential streets. And the timing is almost impossibly tight. When family members arrived the next morning after Nancy didn't show up for church plans, they found blood on the front porch. DNA testing confirmed it was Nancy's. Her purse was inside, her wallet, her phone, her car was in the garage. Everything she would need to go anywhere voluntarily had been left behind. Everything except Nancy herself. The Pima County Sheriff's Department launched what would become the largest missing persons investigation in the recent history of Arizona. More than 400 people from local and federal law enforcement, 40,000 tips at the peak. FBI Director Kash Patel personally released images from Nancy's doorbell camera on February 10th, 10 days after her disappearance. A signal detection aircraft was deployed specifically to search for the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi handshake that Nancy's pacemaker would emit. Google engineers were brought in to help recover data from the Nest camera system. Genetic genealogy analysis, the same technology that eventually solved the Golden State Killer case, was initiated on DNA found at the scene. The investigation was, by any measure, massive, and yet 47 days later, no suspect has been publicly identified. No arrest has been made. No confirmed proof of life has been provided. The $1.2 million reward sits unclaimed, and the FBI is back in the neighborhood, asking about a neighbor who packed up and left before Nancy was taken. Before we get into what those questions mean and why they matter, there is something important about the suspect himself, what the doorbell camera footage revealed and what it didn't, that helps explain exactly why the investigation has reached this particular moment. The images released by FBI Director Kash Patel on February 10th showed a figure that behavioral experts and former law enforcement officials have analyzed in extraordinary detail. He was approximately 5'9" to 5'10" tall, average build, wearing dark clothing and a 3-hole balaclava that completely obscured his face. In several frames, a black 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker backpack was visible on his back, already full when he arrived, not empty and waiting to be loaded with stolen items. A holster was positioned in an unusual place, the front pelvic area of his waist, and where any trained firearms instructor would tell you it should never be. And thick gloves covered his hands. Gloves that multiple experts noted were incompatible with effective operation of the weapon he appeared to be carrying. Former FBI hostage negotiator Chip Massey noted something about that backpack that reframes the entire crime. If your purpose is robbery, you bring empty bags. You don't know what you'll find. You don't know what will be worth taking. You bring capacity. But this suspect arrived with a full backpack, equipment he packed before he ever left for Camino Real. Everything he brought, he already knew he needed. That is not the profile of a robbery. That is the profile of a mission with specific objectives that had been defined in advance. So former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer identified another detail that most observers overlooked entirely. After investigators processed the scene, they changed the locks on the back of Nancy's house. Specifically the back, not the front, not the sides, but the back entrance near the garage. Coffindaffer explained the significance of that decision in clear terms. Investigators don't change specific locks without a reason. They change them when they believe those specific entry points were compromised, when they believe that entry was made through that particular door, when they're concerned that someone who shouldn't have access might still have a key. The fact that they changed locks on the back, Coffindaffer said, makes me think that entry was made from the back, went through the garage, entered the home, as in then the person that we see on video. His duty was actually to disable that camera, which means the person on the doorbell camera, the figure we have all been watching and analyzing for 47 days, may not have been the person who actually entered Nancy's home. His role, according to Coffindaffer's analysis, was to disable the front camera and create the appearance of a front door entry attempt while someone else came in from behind. Division of labor. Two people with two separate roles, two separate entry approaches. Neither of them captured on camera doing the thing that actually mattered, removing Nancy from her home. Now pause on that for a moment and think about what the back entry means in terms of knowledge. Coming in from the back, the doorway through the garage area, through a door that wasn't covered by the front-facing camera, requires knowing that the back was accessible, knowing that the security gate on the front door made the front entrance a poor choice, knowing the layout of the property well enough to plan a rear approach. That is not knowledge a stranger acquires by looking at a house from the street. That is knowledge that comes from having been inside, or from someone who had been inside telling you. A neighbor who had visited over the years. A neighbor who had seen the property from angles that passers-by never have access to. Someone whose proximity to Nancy's life gave them information that they were not supposed to use the way it was ultimately used. And then there is the detail that former FBI agent Maureen O'Connell identified in the blood evidence. O'Connell analyzed the pattern of Nancy's blood on the front porch and reached a specific conclusion. The pattern was consistent with Nancy being carried, not walking. No movement trails, no pattern suggesting someone struggling forward under their own power. A pattern consistent with someone being lifted and transported. Two guys carried her, O'Connell said, and her head tilted. If O'Connell's reading of the blood evidence is accurate, then there were at minimum two people physically involved in removing Nancy from her property. And the 41 minutes between the camera going dark and the pacemaker disconnecting, 41 minutes that former FBI agent Chip Massey called definitively not the signature of a professional operation, were 41 minutes of something going wrong inside that house, something that produced blood, something that involved a struggle, an injury, resistance from an 84-year-old woman who, against everything the suspects likely anticipated, fought back. The blood tells us she didn't give up. It tells us she made this harder than they expected, and it tells us that whatever plan they arrived with had to be adjusted in real time, in ways they hadn't prepared for, over the course of 41 agonizing minutes inside her home. To understand why that matters, why the FBI returning to that quiet street on the Catalina Foothills to ask that specific question is significant rather than routine, you have to first understand what former FBI Special Agent Steve Moore calls the theory of the crime. Moore is a retired FBI special agent with decades of experience investigating violent crimes. He has been one of the most substantive voices analyzing this case publicly through his conversations with News Nation's senior investigative reporter Brian Enton, whose coverage of this case has been among the most reliable and detailed available. When Enton told Moore about the FBI's return to the neighborhood and their questions about the neighbor who moved out and the construction workers, Moore's response was immediate and direct. "The theory of the crime is a big deal," Moore told Enton. "The theory of the crime informs every other bit of investigation you do." He explained what he means by that in plain terms. From the very beginning of this investigation, the working theory, the one that Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed in an NBC News interview on March 13th, the one that drove every major investigative decision, is that this was a targeted crime, not a random burglary that escalated, not an opportunist who saw an elderly woman living alone and acted on impulse. A targeted crime in which someone specifically chose Nancy Guthrie, specifically chose her home, and specifically planned what they were going to do. Nano said it explicitly on camera. "We believe we know why he did this, and we believe that it was targeted." He added that the suspect could absolutely strike again and issued a warning to the entire Catalina Foothills community. "Don't think for a moment because it happened to the Guthrie family you're safe. Keep your wits about you." If it was targeted, Moore explains, then there is one question that precedes every other question in the investigation. Much before you ask who did this, before you ask how they got in, before you ask where Nancy is now, you have to ask, how did the person who did this come to know Nancy Guthrie well enough to target her? Because targeting requires knowledge, and knowledge requires contact. In order to target someone, Moore said, you need to somehow come into contact with them. That sentence is the key to understanding why the FBI is now asking about the neighbor who moved out before Nancy disappeared, and the construction workers who were in the area in the weeks surrounding her abduction. These questions are not the FBI grasping at straws. They are the FBI asking the most fundamental question in this entire investigation. Who had contact with Nancy? Or who moved through her world in ways that would have given them access to the information required to plan this crime? Moore used an analogy that Enton reported on his Brian Enton Investigates podcast, and it is worth understanding clearly. When you lose your car keys, Moore said, you start by looking in the places you normally leave them. That's the first search. If the keys aren't there, you go to the second level. You retrace your steps. You think about what you were wearing. You look in less obvious places. If the second search fails, you go to the third level. You start pulling cushions off couches. You check places you would never normally think to check. So people say, why didn't the FBI do this all already? Moore explained to Enton. Because the normal search yields your keys in about 20 seconds. However, the secondary search yields them in about 2 to 5 minutes. And if you start with undoing the couch cushions in your living room, you'll never get to the bedroom where the keys are. The FBI is now pulling up couch cushions. That is not a sign that the investigation has failed or gone backward. According to Moore, it is precisely where the investigation should be at this stage. Having exhausted the obvious leads, the early tips, the immediate evidence, and arrived at the deeper layer of questions that only become answerable once everything above them has been ruled out. One of those couch cushions is the neighbor who moved out, and the FBI did not arrive at that question randomly. They arrived at it because the theory of the crime, targeted, planned, and requiring inside knowledge, demands an explanation for how that knowledge was obtained. And when you systematically eliminate the people who might have provided it, when you rule out family and close friends in the most obvious categories of contact, you eventually arrive at the people who were closest without being intimate. The people on the same street, the people whose daily presence in the neighborhood would have given them access to a level of observation that looks from the outside completely ordinary. And one of those people moved out before Nancy was taken, the FBI noticed, and now they are asking why. NewsNation's senior investigative reporter Brian Enton confirmed through sources on March 18th that FBI agents had been back in Nancy's neighborhood over the previous 24 hours, returning to neighbors' houses and asking questions that go beyond the immediate hours of February 1st. Among the things those agents were asking about was a neighbor who moved out of the Catalina Foothills before Nancy disappeared. Enton reported this clearly and with appropriate caution. Not to say that that has anything to do with what happened, but that is something the FBI agents are asking about. The caution in Enton's framing matters and deserves to be repeated here. The FBI asking about someone does not make that person a suspect. Investigators in complex cases ask about dozens, sometimes hundreds of people who turn out to have no connection to the crime at all. The process of elimination is itself part of how investigations move forward. Every person who is ruled out narrows the field. Every question answered, even if the answer is nothing unusual, contributes to a picture that eventually becomes clear enough to act on. But the specific detail that the FBI is asking about this particular neighbor, someone who lived in Nancy's community, who was presumably familiar to the residents of that quiet street, who moved out in the period surrounding Nancy's disappearance, is significant for one specific reason. It fits directly within the framework that Moore described. The FBI is looking for anyone who had contact with Nancy, anyone who might have been in a position to observe her patterns, to know her schedule, to understand the layout of her property and the rhythms of her daily life. A neighbor is someone who would have had all of that without ever doing anything that looks suspicious. A neighbor sees you come home. A neighbor knows which days you have visitors. A neighbor can observe, over weeks and months, the patterns that tell you when someone will be alone and when they won't. A neighbor moving through the same quiet street as Nancy would have been invisible in exactly the way that someone gathering intelligence on a target needs to be invisible. None of that means this particular neighbor had anything to do with what happened. It means the FBI is doing what Moore described, pulling up couch cushions, asking questions at the level of the investigation where they now find themselves 47 days in. The construction workers represent the same investigative logic applied to a different category of people. Enton reported that investigators were asking neighbors specifically for the names of contractors and workers who had been present on any construction projects in the Catalina Foothills area in the weeks surrounding Nancy's disappearance. Not general descriptions, Not, have you seen any unfamiliar workers? Specific full names of every individual who had been present on those building sites. Moore explained why construction workers specifically stand out in the context of this investigation, and it comes back to the same principle. Construction activity brings people into quiet residential neighborhoods without raising suspicion. Workers move through these streets in ways that are completely normal, completely expected, completely unremarkable. Nobody looks twice at a truck pulling up to a house under construction. Nobody questions a worker walking down the block during a lunch break. But those same workers see things. They observe the rhythms of the neighborhood. They notice who comes and goes. They see which houses have elderly residents living alone. They might interact briefly with those residents. Nancy herself, years ago, had been part of a neighborhood walking group, and her health in recent years had slowed her down considerably. She didn't drive to a local church. She followed services online, joining the services of a church in New York that Savannah attended via Zoom. That detail, which Enton noted in his reporting and more discussed on the podcast, is significant. It means Nancy's world was smaller than it might appear from the outside. She came into contact with fewer people than an 84-year-old who was regularly out and about in the community. And that makes the question of how the suspect knew enough about her to target her even more specific. If Nancy's daily world was relatively contained, home, family visits, services followed online rather than in person, then the universe of people who had the opportunity to observe her life closely enough to plan this crime is actually narrower than it might seem. Not everyone in Tucson, not anyone who passed by on the street, someone who had specific, repeated, legitimate access to her world. Moore said this directly. Then that would lead one to believe that maybe it was somebody who came into the house or came to her house. And wow, this kind of thing happens. He connected it to the construction worker question explicitly. Not necessarily that there's an indication that any of those contractors have done anything wrong or those workmen have done anything wrong, but they are people who would have very possibly come in contact with Nancy. And he raised something else. The possibility of people who masquerade as workers, who show up on a residential street looking like they belong, looking like they're there for a construction project or a delivery or a maintenance call, when in reality they are gathering information about a specific person in a specific house. And this connects to a broader question that Moore raised in a separate conversation with Enton, a question about the nature of the crime itself that has evolved significantly over the course of the investigation. In the early days of the Nancy Guthrie case, the dominant theory was that this was a kidnapping for ransom. The evidence seemed to support it, the full backpack suggesting preparation, the coordinated approach, the apparent planning, the ransom notes that arrived at media organizations in the days following Nancy's disappearance. Law enforcement took those communications seriously, at least initially, because some of the ransom notes contained details that appeared to match known facts about the crime scene. Details about an Apple Watch, about a floodlight that had been damaged, true about specific elements of the interior of Nancy's home. But as the weeks passed, something shifted. The ransom communications continued to arrive at different media outlets, demanding different amounts in different cryptocurrencies, but no proof of life ever came with them. No verifiable evidence that the person sending the notes actually had Nancy. No communication that could be confirmed as authentic by law enforcement. And eventually, investigators arrested a California man named Derek Colella and charged him with sending fraudulent ransom communications. Not because he had Nancy, but because he was attempting to exploit the crisis for financial gain, sending fake notes to profit from the family's agony. As more notes arrived and none proved authentic, as deadlines in various communications passed without consequence, Steve Moore arrived at a conclusion that he stated directly on the Brian Enton Investigates podcast in early March. I'm no longer 100% in the camp that this was a planned ransom kidnapping. The ransom notes came kind of late, and they didn't really try to provide proof of life. I think it's possible that this was something different. He went further, raising a possibility that is deeply uncomfortable but cannot be ignored in an honest analysis of this case. Nancy may not have been, depending on what this crime turns out to be, she may not have been the primary victim. Moore elaborated, it could be that people were going to different houses, that the perpetrators may have been targeting not Nancy specifically, not Savannah Guthrie specifically, Not even the Guthrie family specifically, but a type of target. Money, elderly women living alone in affluent neighborhoods. Vulnerable people in houses that look like they contain things worth taking or people worth taking. If that theory is correct, it changes the investigative picture significantly. It means the suspects may not have had the intimate knowledge of Nancy's specific life that the targeted crime theory requires. It means the reconnaissance on January 11th, the questions about January 24th, the patterns that look like deliberate surveillance, all of that might have been about understanding the neighborhood and the type of target rather than about understanding Nancy Guthrie as an individual. And it means the suspects could, as both Moore and Nanos have warned publicly, do this again. If they were not trying to specifically take Nancy Guthrie, or if she was selected as a particular kind of victim rather than as a particular person, then whatever drove them to Camino Real on February 1st could drive them to a different street, a different house, a different 84-year-old woman living alone. Moore said it plainly. If it's not kidnapping for ransom, the things that drove them to commit this crime will recur. He called it a public safety concern and said directly, when Entin asked, "Yes, yeah, I think so." Sheriff Nanos, in his March 13th NBC interview, said something strikingly similar when asked whether the suspect could strike again. "Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, criminal minds are criminal minds." Both the retired FBI agent analyzing this case from the outside and the sitting sheriff running it from the inside are saying the same thing. When the person or persons who took Nancy Guthrie are capable of doing it again, and law enforcement believes this enough to warn the public explicitly in those words on national television. That warning is not something that gets issued casually. It is not the kind of statement law enforcement makes when they believe the threat has passed or contained itself. It is the kind of statement they make when they genuinely believe there is a living, active risk that has not been neutralized. Now here is where the investigation as it stands today comes into sharpest focus. Because the FBI's return to Nancy's neighborhood to ask about the neighbor who moved out is happening in the context of a case where every other obvious lead has already been run to ground. The DNA found inside Nancy's home, male DNA, unidentified, a not matching anyone in her close circle, was sent to a laboratory in Florida for analysis. It is a partial mixed sample, meaning it contains genetic material from multiple people and cannot yet be submitted to CODIS, the National DNA Database, which requires complete profiles. Genetic genealogist C.C. Moore, who was instrumental in the technology that identified the Golden State Killer, has said her strong instinct is that the perpetrator's DNA is still present at the scene. She noted that DNA is remarkably durable, and that even with the crime scene having been accessed by family members since the abduction, investigators could still systematically collect and rule out DNA from everyone who has been in the house and isolate the suspect's profile. That work is ongoing, and the gloves found approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home, which appeared to resemble the gloves worn by the suspect in the doorbell camera footage and briefly became one of the most significant evidence leads in the case, turned out to contain DNA from a local restaurant employee who had no connection to the investigation. 16 gloves were ultimately found in the vicinity, most attributable to search volunteers rather than to the perpetrators. That lead has been exhausted. The backpack the suspect was carrying, a black 25-liter Ozark Trail Hiker pack, a Walmart-exclusive product that investigators initially hoped would be traceable through purchase records, turned out to have likely been acquired secondhand, or at minimum not through a direct retail purchase that left a record. That trail went cold. The vehicle captured on a neighbor's Ring camera at 2:36 a.m., 2.5 miles from Nancy's home, the vehicle whose timing aligned so precisely with the pacemaker disconnect, has not been publicly identified. Nanos confirmed in early March that investigators are aware of it and are looking into it, but that they have not been able to identify the specific car. "We're looking at that vehicle as well as hundreds of thousands of other vehicles that were out driving that time of day," he said. The signal detection aircraft searching for Nancy's pacemaker, a technology capable of detecting Bluetooth and Wi-Fi signals from 800 to 1,000 feet in the air, has found nothing. The pacemaker signal has not been detected anywhere within the search perimeter. The cadaver dogs that were deployed in the early days of the investigation are no longer active in the search. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed last week that the use of cadaver dogs has been put on hold. A retired K-9 officer told Parade magazine that this decision defies logic. While other experts have explained that departments may suspend K-9 deployments for several reasons, including if they believe the missing person may still be alive and concealed in a location where dogs would have difficulty detecting them, or if they simply don't have a viable search area to target. And on March 19th, 47 days into the investigation, Savannah Guthrie stopped by the Today Show studio in New York for the first time since her mother disappeared. She did not go on air. A Today spokesperson confirmed she visited to be with and thank her colleagues, while making clear that she remains focused on supporting her family and working to bring Nancy home. She plans to return to the show on air, the spokesperson said, but has provided no timeline. That visit, the first meaningful step toward her professional life in 7 weeks, was a moment that told its own quiet story about where this family is in the process of enduring something that has no clear end in sight. All of which makes the FBI's return to the neighborhood to ask about the neighbor and the construction workers not a moment of desperation, but a moment of precision. They have eliminated the most obvious answers. They have processed the most immediate evidence. They have followed the trails that the first weeks of the investigation revealed. And now they are in the phase that Steve Moore described. The phase where you pull up the couch cushions, where you go back to the neighborhood with more specific questions, better formed questions, questions informed by everything that has been ruled out and everything that hasn't. It is worth being specific about what has been ruled out, because understanding the shape of what remains requires understanding what has already been eliminated. The DNA found inside Nancy's home, male DNA, unidentified, not matching anyone in her close circle, was sent to a laboratory in Florida for analysis. It is a partial mixed sample, meaning it contains genetic material from multiple people and cannot yet be submitted to CODIS, the National DNA Database, which requires complete profiles. Genetic genealogist Cece Moore, who was instrumental in developing the technology that eventually identified the Golden State Killer decades after his crimes, has said her strong instinct is that the perpetrator's DNA is still present at the scene. She noted that DNA is remarkably durable, that environmental conditions would have to be extreme to fully degrade it, and that even with the crime scene having been accessed by family members since the abduction, investigators could still systematically collect and rule out DNA from everyone who has legitimately been in the house and isolate the suspect's profile. That work, she suggested, may yet yield what other evidence has not. It is ongoing. Had the gloves found approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home, which appeared to resemble the gloves worn by the suspect in the doorbell camera footage, and which briefly became one of the most significant leads in the case, turned out to contain DNA from a local restaurant employee who had no connection to the investigation. 16 gloves in total were found in the surrounding area, with most attributable to search volunteers. That evidence trail has been exhausted. The backpack the suspect was carrying, a black 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker pack, a Walmart exclusive product that investigators initially hoped could be traced through retail purchase records, turned out to have likely been acquired secondhand, with no traceable record of purchase. By early March, our Nanos was telling reporters that the backpack may not have been purchased directly from Walmart at all. That lead went cold. The vehicle captured on a neighbor's Ring camera at 2:36 a.m., 2.5 miles from Nancy's home. The vehicle, whose timing aligned so precisely with the pacemaker disconnect that it became one of the most closely studied pieces of evidence in the case, has not been publicly identified. Nanos confirmed in early March that investigators are aware of it and examining it, but that they have not been able to identify the specific car. We're looking at that vehicle as well as hundreds of thousands of other vehicles that were out driving that time of day, he said, a statement that honestly reflects both the significance of the evidence and the difficulty of the work. The signal detection aircraft, equipped with technology from Parsons Corporation, capable of detecting Bluetooth and Wi-Fi signals from 800 to 1,000 feet in the air, specifically deployed to search for the handshake signal that Nancy's pacemaker would emit as it searched for her iPhone, has found nothing. The pacemaker signal has not been detected anywhere within the search perimeter. Whether that means Nancy is being held somewhere beyond the search radius, or that the pacemaker has been damaged or destroyed, or that something has happened to Nancy herself that would explain the silence of the device, investigators have not said, and the evidence does not allow us to determine which possibility is most likely. The cadaver dogs that were deployed in the early days of the investigation are no longer active. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed last week that the use of cadaver dogs has been put on hold. A retired K-9 officer publicly called this decision something that defies logic, expressing frustration that one of the most basic tools for finding missing persons is not being actively used. Other experts offered different context, that departments may suspend K-9 deployments when they believe the missing person may still be alive, when they don't have a viable search area to target, or when the resources are needed elsewhere. Nanos himself said anything is possible when asked whether Nancy might still be alive, declining to discuss specific leads or evidence. The official position is that the search continues. What the cadaver dog decision signals about investigators' private assessment is something only they can answer. It is, who was this person? When exactly did they leave? Was the timing of that departure connected in any way to the events of February 1st? Did this person have any contact with Nancy? Did anyone in the neighborhood notice anything about this person that seemed unusual or out of place? These questions may yield nothing. The neighbor may turn out to have moved for perfectly ordinary reasons. A job change, a family situation, the simple desire to live somewhere else, with no connection whatsoever to what happened to Nancy. The investigation will rule that out and move on, or they may yield something, a detail, a connection, a name, a thread that, when pulled, leads somewhere the investigation hasn't yet been. That is the nature of this phase of the work. You ask the questions you haven't asked yet, because the questions you already asked didn't give you what you needed. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer, who spent 25 years investigating kidnappings and violent crimes for the Bureau and has been analyzing this case publicly, has consistently said that whoever planned this crime had access to inside knowledge about Nancy's home, her schedule, her security systems, the layout of the property. My number one theory, Coffindaffer has said, is that people with some tangential connection to the household exposed insider knowledge to criminals. Tangential connection, not an intimate relationship, not a family member or close friend, a connection that looks ordinary from the outside, a service worker, a neighbor, and someone with a legitimate reason to be in or around the property. That was used to gather information without raising suspicion. That framework perfectly accommodates both of the FBI's current investigative focuses. A neighbor who was part of the fabric of the street, who might have been in a position to observe Nancy's patterns over months. A construction worker on a nearby project who had access to the neighborhood without anyone asking questions about why they were there. Neither of these categories implies guilt. Neither implies that the FBI has found a suspect, but both represent the kind of person who might have had the specific, granular knowledge of Nancy Guthrie's daily life that this crime appears to have required. And there is one more element of the investigation's current state that deserves to be addressed directly, because it connects everything we've discussed to the question of what happens next. Steve Moore raised a question in his most recent conversations with Brian Enton that he called fundamental to understanding the case. And it is a question that most coverage of the investigation has not fully grappled with. He said it is the one thing he would most want to know if he were working this case from the inside. And the question is this: how ambulatory was Nancy Guthrie in the weeks and months before she disappeared? How traveling was she? She had a car, but she didn't go to church at her local church. She Zoomed it. She followed online services for a church in New York that Savannah went to. Yes, that leads me to believe that she didn't get out of the house as much. Moore's point is that if Nancy's world was relatively small, if she was not regularly moving through the community, not regularly interacting with new people, not regularly placing herself in situations where a stranger might observe her patterns, then the universe of people who had sufficient access to her life to plan this crime is actually quite limited. And a limited universe of possible people with that access is, paradoxically, something the investigation can work with. It is something that can be narrowed further. Every person who is confirmed to have had legitimate access to Nancy's home or property can be identified, interviewed, and evaluated. Every person who was in a position to observe her routines can be placed in a timeline. Every connection, however tangential, can be mapped. The neighbor who moved out, the construction workers whose names the FBI is now collecting, the service providers who came to the house over the months before February 1st, the delivery drivers, the handymen, anyone who had a reason to be at or near Nancy's home in the year before she disappeared. One of those people, or someone connected to one of those people, may have the answer that 47 days of investigation have not yet produced. One of them may know something they haven't said. One of them may have noticed something that seemed insignificant at the time and doesn't yet understand its significance. One of them may be sitting with information that they think they can hold on to indefinitely and need to understand they cannot, because the FBI is not stopping. Wes, the investigation is not winding down in any meaningful sense. It has changed form, from the massive, visible, 400-person deployment of the first weeks to the smaller, more methodical, more targeted work of the current phase. But the DNA analysis continues. The genealogy work continues. The digital forensics continue. And now the neighborhood canvassing continues with sharper questions than before, directed at more specific people, informed by everything that the first 47 days have taught investigators about where the answer is most likely to be found. Steve Moore put the current moment of the investigation in perspective with a phrase that is worth holding on to. He said the FBI is now obviously at the point where they are pulling up cushions in the couch. And then he added, they are not actually at day 2. They are exactly where they should be, given everything that has come before. Where they should be is asking about the neighbor who moved out. Where they should be is collecting the names of every person who carried tools down those quiet streets and observed the rhythms of the Catalina Foothills from the inside of a construction project. Where they should be is asking the question that has always mattered most, in the most specific possible terms. Who knew Nancy Guthrie well enough to take her? Nancy Guthrie is still missing. She is 84 years old. She has been gone for 47 days. She requires medications. She has a pacemaker. She is someone's mother, someone's grandmother, someone who sent Christmas cards and waved at neighbors, and followed church services online from a living room in Tucson where she should have been safe. And the answer to what happened to her begins with proximity, with someone who was close enough, present enough, trusted enough by the rhythms of that quiet street to become invisible within it. Someone whose presence on Camino Real required no explanation. Someone who knew, because they lived or worked or spent time in that neighborhood, the things about Nancy's life that should never have been used against her. That is who the FBI is looking for right now. Not a stranger, not someone from outside who chose a house at random, someone who was there, someone who walked that street, someone who may have waved at Nancy the same way her other neighbors did, while filing away the details of her patterns that would eventually make it possible to take her in the dark. The neighbor who moved out may be that person. Or they may have seen that person. Or they may hold, without yet knowing it, a piece of information that puts a name to something the investigation has been circling for 47 days. Think about what it takes to know someone well enough to take them. That was the question we started with. The FBI is now, in the most literal possible way, knocking on doors to find the answer. Someone in that neighborhood knows who that person is, and the door the FBI needs to knock on, the one with the answer behind it, is still out there waiting. The FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. That is 1-800-225-5324. You can submit information online at tips.fbi.gov. The reward is $1.2 million, $1 million from Nancy's family, $100,000 from the FBI, $100,000 from an anonymous donor, for information that leads to Nancy's safe return or to the identification and arrest of those responsible. If you have any information about this case, about the neighbor who moved out, about any construction workers in the Catalina Foothills area in January 2026, about any person who seemed to be paying unusual attention to Nancy's home or schedule in the weeks or months before February 1st, please contact the FBI today, not tomorrow. Today, Nancy Guthrie sent Christmas cards to her neighbors. She waved at people walking their dogs. She assumed that the people who shared her street were exactly what they appeared to be. Someone proved her wrong, and somewhere in the memory of that neighborhood, the truth of what happened is still waiting to be found. Subscribe to Unsolved Archive for continued coverage of this case as the investigation develops. Every piece of new information, every door the FBI knocks on, every question that moves this investigation one step forward, we will be here, covering it the way this case deserves to be covered. Because Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood still has answers to give, and we are not finished asking.